The Rockefeller Empire began in the year 1870 when John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his brother William created the Standard Oil Company of Cleveland, Ohio. It was through this company that they assembled the largest private fortune in history.
God damn. With over 250 competitors in the United States alone, Standard Oil very quickly began using cutthroat techniques designed to demolish all their competition.
Rockefeller made a deal with the railroad companies, securing discounted shipping rates in exchange for regular shipments. With this, he undercut competitors' prices until companies surrendered or sold out to Standard Oil. He would also buy up all the oil barrels so the competition had no place to store or distribute their oil.
So this very young man controls what is not only a national but an international monopoly in a commodity that is about to become the most important strategic commodity in the world economy.
Make no mistake about it, the machine that runs the entire world's industrial economy is fossil fuels of some type. Gas, natural gas, oil, coal, what have you.
There is no other industry that comes remotely close to the profits of this industry. None, period.
And just to be clear, these are the highest profits in the history of the world, unparalleled with any other industry. The defense industry, pharmaceuticals, banks, you name it, no comparison.
A person might ask, why is the oil industry so gigantic? Well, you might be shocked when you find out how many things are made from oil and oil derivatives.
I think we sometimes don't have any real appreciation for how powerful oil is. Our agricultural industry is totally dependent on oil for insecticides and fertilizers and other chemicals, and for packaging everything. Our medical industry is dependent on oil, for feeding medicines and packaging and all the clothes that people wear, medical workers. You can go on and on and on. And the oil is incredibly powerful. It doesn't even have to have huge lobbies of its own, although it does have pretty big lobbies. But it can also fall back on the lobbyists from insurance companies and banking companies and healthcare companies, like I said, and food companies who are all very closely tied in with big oil. Big oil is extremely powerful.
And what people were most concerned about with Standard Oil's rise wasn't its monopoly control of kerosene, but rather was its control of the government.
It was a conspiracy, really. It was one of the first great economic conspiracies in this country.
They had massive strikes, they had massive protests, they had massive sit-ins, they convinced the Democrats, they convinced the Republicans, they founded their own parties, they changed state laws, they changed federal laws. They forced the government to ultimately change its attitude towards the companies. And so finally, through all of this organizing in 1911, the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil into 34 separate pieces. The biggest problem is that the organizers, the activists, the people, had this victory, and then they kind of turned away and went to work on other things, which is what we often do, instead of remaining vigilant and ensuring that the government maintained its regulation over the breakup. And the government didn't maintain its regulation over the breakup. Why we're in such a similar moment today is, of course, that we have corporations have gotten so large that they are exercising control over government decision-making.
Now, I'm not a fan of the government doing anything, but I've got to ask, why isn't the government doing anything?
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
You don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. These people went to the same universities and fraternities. They're on the same boards of directors. They're in the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them, and they're getting it. And there used to be 7 oil companies. There are now 3. It will soon be 2. The things that matter in this country have been reduced in choice. There are 2 political parties. There are a handful of insurance companies. There are about 6 or 7 information things. But if you want a bagel, there are 23 flavors because you have the illusion. You have the illusion of choice.
Perhaps the most revealing confession ever comes from John Rockefeller's son, David, in his 2002 autobiography, Memoirs.
But the takeover of the oil industry was just the beginning for old Rockefeller.
All persons involved in a conspiracy for a criminal purpose automatically become criminals, criminally liable. And that is the case of everybody who has anything to do with the Federal Reserve System.
The Fed was formed not in Washington, D.C., not in the halls of Congress or some meeting room, but it was formed on a private island off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. This island in those days was privately owned. It was a resort island. It was a club. They called the Jekyll Island Club. And its members were a relatively small group of billionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates and their families. And they went there during the cold winter months because they wanted to get away from the ice and snow from New York. Not only did they go to this island for the meeting, but they went under conditions of great secrecy. For example, one of them carried a shotgun in a big black case. Just in case he had been confronted by a reporter, he was prepared to tell them that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And the funny thing about that is that we learned later from his children and his biographers that this man never owned a gun. He had borrowed that shotgun just as a decoy and as part of the deception.
In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed through Congress. The bill was large and obscurely worded, and came at a time when Congress was preoccupied with departure for the holidays.
And so it was signed into law on December the 23rd, 1913, by President Woodrow Wilson.
Hans Sennholz has called the creation of the Fed the most tragic blunder ever committed by Congress. The day it was passed, old America died, and a new era began.
After this act was passed, President Woodrow Wilson wrote in regret, So as you can see, once Rockefeller took over the oil industry, he immediately went for the financial sector. And he was successful with the creation of the Federal Reserve. But what would he do with his power, one might ask?
I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, which, by the way, financed the Communist Revolution, financed the Hitler Revolution, and financed the Japanese entry into World War II. Because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war.
And according to this U.S. military intel report dated July 15, 1941, Rockefeller's Standard Oil sold and supplied oil to the German government in World War II.
Ooh, how does this fucking work?
In the early 20th century, Rockefeller organized a coup on medical research throughout the world. What he did was sponsor research and donate to universities and medical schools whose research was drug-based. And any institutions which refused to partake in drug-based research were refused funding and soon disappeared at the hands of the pharmaceutical industry. These donations were effective techniques designed to avert attention over the monopoly of the education system. And it is just that simple. This was a complete takeover of the international medical community and education system, because then these institutions taught their students exactly what Rockefeller wanted. In 1939, a partnership called the Drug Trust was formed between the Rockefeller Empire and the German chemical company IG Farben. It's interesting to note that IG Farben is the single largest profiteer in World War II. Auschwitz was a 100% subsidiary of IG Farben, and IG Farben produced the Zyklon B used in the concentration camps. So while 6 million people were being murdered in the Holocaust, IG Farben made enormous profits.
A good friend of mine, Tony Sutton, wrote a book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and he absolutely proves that every step of Nazism was financed by Wall Street bankers. They're tied into the consortium of central bankers of the entire world.
It was not a psychopath Adolf Hitler that brought about World War II and the Holocaust, but rather the